Clara had never been particularly close to her grandfather, Samuel Hayes. In fact, she had never even met him. He had passed away when her mother was just a young girl, and the stories about him were few and far between. Whenever she asked her mother about him, she was always met with tight-lipped responses. Her mother would change the subject quickly, or there would be an uncomfortable silence that hung in the air. The mystery surrounding him had always intrigued Clara, though she had never pressed too hard. But now, as she sat in the attic of her childhood home, sorting through old family heirlooms, she found herself face to face with something she couldn't ignore. A letter, old and yellowed with age, tucked inside a box that hadn't been touched in decades. The envelope was surprisingly well preserved, considering the years it had spent in the attic. It had the faint scent of dust and time, with no return address, only her mother's name written in a neat, cursive handwriting. Clara's curiosity grew. Why had this letter been hidden away? Why had no one mentioned it before? She tore open the envelope carefully, as if afraid the contents would disintegrate in her hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased and worn at the edges, with a few words written in the same handwriting as the envelope. Clara squinted at the faded ink. "If you value the truth, you must never search for what you're not meant to find." The sentence sent a chill down her spine. Clara's eyes lingered on the words, her mind racing. What did this mean? And why would her grandfather have written something like this? She flipped the page, hoping there was more, but the back was blank. She couldn't help but feel that this letter was a message meant just for her, even though it had been addressed to her mother. Who was Samuel Hayes, really? What secrets had he been keeping from the family? Why did it feel like something had been buried, waiting to be uncovered? Clara had always known there were gaps in her family's history, but this letter seemed to point to something far deeper than mere generational silence. What if everything she thought she knew about her grandfather was wrong? What if he had been hiding something far darker? Determined to find out, Clara went downstairs to ask her mother about the letter. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, her back to Clara. When she turned to face her daughter, Clara could see the immediate change in her expression. Something was off. The warm, welcoming gaze her mother usually had now seemed distant, cautious. "Where did you find that?" Her mother's voice cracked slightly, as if the question was more loaded than it should have been. Clara hesitated, looking at the letter still clenched in her hand. It was in the attic in one of the boxes. Who was Samuel Hayes? Mom, why did Grandpa write this? Her mother's face drained of color. She put her coffee cup down slowly, her hands shaking. "Clara, I told you. There are things about your grandfather that you don't need to know." "I don't understand," Clara pressed. "Why not? Who was he really? What's the secret?" Her mother stood up abruptly, her face a mixture of anger and fear. "Because it's better this way. It's better you don't ask any more questions. Please, Clara." But Clara could see the fear in her mother's eyes. There was something more going on here, something that no one had ever been willing to talk about. And now she had to know what it was. For days after the encounter with her mother, Clara found herself unable to shake off the image of her mother's terrified face. She had always known that her mother kept a lot to herself, especially when it came to her father, but she had never seen her react so strongly to a simple question. The more Clara thought about it, the more convinced she became that her grandfather's past wasn't just a family mystery. It was a dangerous secret that someone wanted to keep hidden at all costs. Her first attempt to ask her extended family about Samuel Hayes was equally fruitless. She called up her uncles and aunts, but each conversation ended in a hurry, as if they had all been waiting for her to bring it up. The replies were all the same. "Your grandfather was a quiet man, a hard worker. There's nothing to say about him." But Clara didn't buy it. It wasn't like her uncles and aunts to be so dismissive, especially when they were usually so open about everything else. They were all hiding something, and Clara was determined to figure out what it was. She decided to visit her Aunt Karen, her father's younger sister, who lived a few miles outside of town. Aunt Karen was known for her storytelling, often sharing stories of the family's past at gatherings, so Clara hoped she would be more open than the others. She arrived at Aunt Karen's house and, after exchanging pleasantries, steered the conversation toward her grandfather. "Mom never talks about him," Clara began, trying to sound casual. "I found a letter he wrote, and it made me wonder what really happened to him. What was he like?" Aunt Karen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, but Clara could see that she was holding something back. "He did what he had to do and he kept to himself. That's all you need to know." Clara pressed on, but Aunt Karen's tone grew more defensive. "I don't want to discuss it, Clara. It's in the past. Just let it go." Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. It was clear now that her family had been hiding something for years, and the more they refused to talk about it, the more certain Clara became that there was something dangerous in her grandfather's past. Something that had been buried, perhaps even deliberately erased. Clara couldn't let it go. Every time she tried to ignore the letter or move on, her thoughts kept circling back to her grandfather's death, the strange circumstances surrounding it, and the cryptic message in the letter. Something wasn't right, and she knew that the truth was hidden somewhere in the past, buried deep enough that no one dared to talk about it. With no answers from her family, Clara turned to another avenue: research. She knew she had to dig into the past herself. Her first step was to visit the local library and search through old newspaper archives. The library had a small section dedicated to local history, and Clara spent hours scanning through microfiche, hoping to find any mention of Samuel Hayes. At first, the search seemed fruitless. There were no significant articles about him, just passing mentions in old business listings or photographs from family events. But then, buried in a 1963 edition of the Little Creek Gazette, Clara found a single line that caught her attention. It was a small article, tucked away near the back of the paper, but it seemed important. The headline read, "Local businessman Samuel Hayes found dead under mysterious circumstances." The article itself was brief and vague. It mentioned that Samuel Hayes had been found dead in his home, with no signs of foul play, and that the authorities had ruled the death natural. However, there was a strange sentence buried deep in the story. While authorities have ruled Samuel Hayes' death as natural, some local residents remain suspicious. Reports of forced entry into the home have raised questions. Clara's stomach churned as she read those words. Forced entry? Natural death? It didn't make sense. Her grandfather had died just a few days after Clara's mother had left the family home for college. Was it possible that her mother had known something about his death all along, but had been too afraid to speak of it? Clara immediately made plans to return to the town where her grandfather had lived, hoping that local records or long-forgotten stories might help her unravel this mystery. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her grandfather's death was no accident. Someone had wanted him dead, and that someone was still out there, hiding in the shadows. Clara arrived back in Little Creek, a small town that looked like it hadn't changed much in decades. The main street was lined with old brick buildings, most of them vacant, with only a few surviving businesses still open. The air was thick with the smell of pine trees and aged wood. Clara hadn't been here in years, but there was something unsettling about the place now, as if the past was still lingering in the corners, waiting to be discovered. She drove to the house where her grandfather had lived, now owned by strangers who had moved in a few months after his death. The house sat at the edge of town, near the woods, isolated and quiet. Clara had always heard stories about the house, that it was cursed, haunted by the secrets it kept. She had dismissed these stories as nothing more than local superstition. But now, standing in front of it, Clara felt the weight of those tales. The house was old, dark, and weather-beaten, with ivy creeping up the stone walls. It looked more like a place where memories were trapped rather than lived. Clara stood there for a long time, staring at it, before she made her way to the front door. She knocked 3 times, her heart beating faster with every second. When no one answered, she tried the handle, finding it unlocked. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the house was dimly lit, filled with the musty scent of long-neglected rooms. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound echoing through the silence. The walls were lined with old portraits, of her grandfather and his family, of a past that seemed long gone. Clara's footsteps carried her through the house, her eyes scanning every detail, every item that could tell her something more. She found her way to the study, the room where her grandfather had spent most of his time. The desk was covered with papers, most of them yellowed and brittle with age. Clara went through them carefully, hoping for a clue. Anything that could tell her more about what had really happened. There were receipts, old letters, and journals, but one piece of paper stood out among the rest. It was a business card, worn and faded, with a name written on it in bold, black ink. Frank McAllister, private investigator. Clara's mind raced. Why would her grandfather have kept a private investigator's business card? And why had he never mentioned it? Could McAllister have been hired to look into something? Or had Samuel Hayes been investigating someone? Clara turned the card over, expecting to find an address or phone number. But instead, there was just one sentence. Be careful what you ask. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. A chill ran down Clara's spine. It was the same kind of warning that her grandfather had written in the letter. This was no coincidence. Clara's hands trembled as she carefully placed the business card back on the desk. She wasn't sure what to think anymore. Had her grandfather been involved in something dangerous? Or had he been trying to protect someone from the same danger? She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to find Frank McAllister. After a few hours of searching, Clara found that McAllister's private investigation business had long since closed. However, one name kept coming up. William Billy Green, a local businessman who had been in frequent contact with McAllister back in the 1970s. Green's name seemed to be connected to almost everything in Little Creek. His name appeared on business transactions, local elections, and even local charity events. But the more Clara researched, the more she realized that Billy Green wasn't just any businessman. He was a man with many secrets. Clara's next stop was the local diner, a greasy spoon that had been in operation for as long as anyone could remember. The walls were lined with faded photographs, and the coffee tasted like it had been brewing since the 1980s. Clara took a seat at the counter and waited, hoping someone might know something about Green or McAllister. An older man sat down next to her. His face was weathered, with a scar running down his cheek. He had the look of someone who had seen it all and didn't want to talk about any of it. Clara decided to try her luck. "Excuse me, sir," she said, keeping her voice casual. "I'm trying to learn more about Frank McAllister. He was a private investigator here years ago. Do you remember him?" The man glanced at her briefly, then turned his attention back to his coffee. He didn't answer right away, but Clara could see his eyes narrow. She pressed on. "I know this sounds strange, but I'm trying to learn about my grandfather. He had some dealings with McAllister. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The man set his coffee cup down with a soft clink. "I know McAllister. We all knew him around here. He was a good investigator. But he got too deep into things, started asking questions no one wanted answered." He paused, looking at Clara as if debating whether to say more. "You're looking for answers, huh?" Clara nodded. "Be careful, girl," the man said. "Some things around here don't stay buried for long. People like McAllister and Green, they don't just let things go. And your grandfather, well, he was involved in something bigger than you realize." "Bigger than what?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. The man looked around nervously, then leaned in closer. "You want answers? You need to talk to Green. But don't say I told you. That man's got his fingers in all kinds of things, and he's not the kind to forget a face." The next day, Clara made her way to Billy Green's office. His business was tucked away in the back of a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and old trucks. The air felt thick, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Clara had never been to Green's office, but she had seen him around town. He was always well-dressed, his presence commanding respect. She hesitated for a moment before walking inside. The door opened with a creak, and Clara stepped into the dimly lit room. Green was sitting behind a large wooden desk, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the overcast weather. He didn't look up at first, but Clara could feel his attention on her, as though he was assessing her from the moment she entered. "I'm Clara Hayes," she said, standing tall. I need to talk to you about my grandfather, Samuel Hayes. Green's fingers paused on the edge of a paper, and he finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he spoke. "You're his granddaughter, huh? Haven't heard that name in a long time. What do you want with Samuel Hayes?" Clara took a deep breath. "I'm trying to find out what happened to him. He was working with a private investigator, Frank McAllister. I found out some things that don't add up, and I need to know the truth." Green's gaze hardened. "The truth? You don't want the truth, girl. No one does. People who dig too deep around here end up buried with the answers." Clara wasn't deterred. "I don't care. I need to know what happened to my grandfather. I need to know why he's gone and what he was involved in." Green leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Well, you've come to the right place. But you should know, sometimes what you're looking for isn't something you can just walk away from." Clara was done playing games. "Tell me what you know, Mr. Green." Billy Green leaned forward, the intensity of his gaze making Clara feel like she was caught in his trap. He reached under his desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. It was old, its edges worn and torn as if it had been handled countless times. He set it down in front of Clara. "This is the last thing I'll ever give you," he said, his voice low and measured. "Your grandfather got tangled up in something bigger than he could handle. People like McAllister tried to help him, but he was already too deep. He wanted out, but there's no way out of something like that." Clara opened the folder slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside were photographs, documents, and maps, most of them unfamiliar. Some of the photos showed her grandfather with men she didn't recognize. In one of the pictures, he was shaking hands with a man in a dark suit, his smile forced, as if he were trying to hide something. In another, he was standing beside McAllister, the private investigator, looking tense, as if he were being watched. Billy Green's voice broke through Clara's thoughts. This was a network, Clara. A network of people who controlled more than just businesses. They controlled the town, the sheriff's office, the local politics. Your grandfather was a part of it. He didn't have a choice. Clara's hands shook as she flipped through the photos. Who were they? What did they do? Green's eyes narrowed further. "I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this. They were involved in things no one should ever know about. And when your grandfather tried to walk away from them, they didn't just let him go." Clara's mind was racing as Green's words echoed in her ears. She could barely process the weight of what she had just uncovered. Her grandfather had been involved with some kind of underground network. People who had power, who had control over every part of the town. And now, those people knew she was asking questions. As she left Green's office, a strange sense of dread settled over her. The truth was more complicated, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Clara knew that she couldn't stop now. She had to finish what she started. But she also knew that her search for answers could come at a steep price. The night Clara returned to her rented cabin, her mind was a whirlwind. Her grandfather's ties to the underground network, the photographs, and Green's cryptic warnings played on a loop in her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was lurking just beyond the shadows. As she locked the door behind her, she noticed a figure standing by the window of her small living room, silhouetted by the streetlight outside. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She took a cautious step toward the figure, her hand instinctively reaching for the lamp on the table, ready to defend herself if necessary. But as she flicked the light on, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. There was a soft knock at the door. Clara froze, unsure of what to do. Who could it be? She hadn't told anyone where she was staying. She cautiously peered through the peephole, her heart racing. To her surprise, it was Frank McAllister's daughter, Samantha McAllister. She opened the door slightly. "What are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice filled with confusion and suspicion. "I know this looks strange," Samantha said in a low voice, glancing nervously around. "But I need to talk to you. I've been trying to reach you, but you've been hard to track down. Your grandfather, he and my father were tangled up in something dangerous. They weren't just investigating something. They were being watched, monitored, And now it seems like it's your turn. Clara stepped aside, allowing Samantha into the cabin. What are you talking about? What danger? Samantha sighed, her face drawn. We're not the only ones who've been trying to find out what happened to Frank. He disappeared shortly after your grandfather died. My dad knew something. He uncovered something he shouldn't have. And then he just vanished. Clara's heart sank. So, you think my grandfather was murdered because of what he knew? Samantha looked at Clara with a haunted expression. I don't just think it. I know it. I came here to warn you. Because I think they're coming for you, too. The next morning, Clara met with Samantha at the local library. They sat at a small table in the back, surrounded by old newspapers, microfiche, and dusty volumes. Clara's mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper she went, the more dangerous things would become. I've been looking through my father's files, Samantha said, pulling a stack of papers from her bag. And I found something strange, something that might explain why Frank disappeared. It was all in code, but I think I've cracked part of it. The papers mention a meeting that happened right before Frank disappeared. Your grandfather was there, and so was Billy Green. Clara took the papers, her fingers trembling. She scanned through them, noting how they were written in a series of cryptic phrases and numbers. At first glance, it looked like nonsense, but Clara could see that there was a pattern. We need to find the rest of these files, Clara said, her voice firm. If this is what I think it is, it could be the key to everything. If your father and my grandfather were onto something this big, there's no telling what kind of trouble we're in now. Samantha nodded. I'll help you, but be careful. I think whoever is involved in this is still watching, and they won't hesitate to stop anyone from finding out what really happened. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Everyone had their own agendas, their own secrets, but the pieces were starting to come together. And one thing was clear, someone didn't want the truth to come out. As Clara and Samantha continued their search, Clara couldn't help but notice strange occurrences happening around her. At night, she heard whispers outside her cabin, but when she checked, no one was there. The feeling of being watched never left her. The longer she stayed in Little Creek, the more she felt like the town itself was suffocating her, holding her in a tight grip of fear and mystery. One evening, Clara decided to visit the local cemetery, where her grandfather was buried. The graveyard was overgrown with ivy and neglected tombstones, its silence broken only by the wind rustling the leaves. She stood in front of Samuel Hayes' grave, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. Why didn't you tell me the truth? She whispered, her voice filled with frustration. What were you hiding? She reached down to touch the cold stone, her fingers brushing against the name carved into it. As she stood there, lost in thought, a voice broke the stillness. You won't find the answers here. Clara spun around, startled. Standing behind her was a man she didn't recognize. Tall, with graying hair and a weathered face. He wore a dark coat, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. He looked familiar, but Clara couldn't place him. Who are you? She asked, trying to steady her voice. I'm someone who knew your grandfather. My name is Greg Hill. I worked with him for years, the man said, his voice low. We were part of something much bigger than just Little Creek. And if you're looking for answers, you need to stop digging. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What do you mean? What was he involved in? Greg stepped closer, his gaze hardening. There's a reason he tried to pull away. There's a reason McAllister disappeared. The people your grandfather got tangled with, they're dangerous. And they're still out there. If you keep asking questions, you'll be next. Clara's chest tightened with dread. She had thought she was close to the truth. But now, with this new revelation, she felt more lost than ever. The next few days were a blur. Clara couldn't stop thinking about Greg Hill's warning. She was beginning to understand the scope of what her grandfather had been involved in. But the more she uncovered, the more questions piled up. With Samantha's help, Clara dug deeper into the papers Frank McAllister had left behind. They uncovered details about the network her grandfather had been investigating. A group of powerful individuals who had their hands in nearly every part of the town's economy, politics, and law enforcement. They were untouchable, their reach extending far beyond Little Creek. Clara realized that the network was not just a local issue, it had national implications. Her grandfather had discovered something so dangerous, so explosive, that it had cost him his life. And now it seemed it was coming for her. She and Samantha tracked down more of McAllister's old contacts, finding a handful of people who had once worked with him. But each one had either disappeared or gone into hiding. Every lead they followed seemed to only get them deeper into the web of secrecy and danger that surrounded her grandfather's death. The more Clara pieced together, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her grandfather anymore. It was about something far bigger, and it was about to change everything. Clara knew she was running out of time. The network was closing in on her, and with each new revelation, the danger only seemed to grow. She was tired, exhausted from the constant fear and the endless questions. But she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to the truth. One night, after following a tip from a former associate of McAllister's, Clara found herself standing in front of a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she knew she had to face whatever was inside if she wanted answers. Inside the dark, cold building, Clara came face to face with the people who had been behind everything. The ones who had orchestrated her grandfather's death. The ones who had kept Little Creek under their control. She knew she couldn't take them all on alone, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. Not anymore. As Clara confronted the people responsible for everything, the truth came crashing down. The network wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was a shadow government, a system of control that extended into every corner of American life. Her grandfather had uncovered it, and for that, he had been silenced. But as the confrontation reached its climax, Clara learned something more chilling. Someone she trusted had been part of the conspiracy all along. Clara had learned the truth, but at a terrible cost. As she left Little Creek for the final time, she knew that the answers she had uncovered were just the beginning. The network was still out there, and the price of knowledge was far higher than she ever imagined. But she had done what her grandfather couldn't, and she had brought the truth to light. If you've been following Clara's journey to uncover the dark secrets of her grandfather's past, then make sure to subscribe to War Chronicles Unseen for more true stories, hidden histories, and real-life mysteries.